Welcome everyone to the ICArEHB Dialogues. My name is Carlos. I will be convening today's dialogues about archaeological migration narratives. This is the last ICArEHB Dialogue of the 2023 series about migrations and dispersals in prehistory. In the previous sessions, we had guests discussing migrations at different stages of human evolution and dispersals in Africa, Europe, and the Americas. All these dialogues can be watched again in the ICArEHB webpage or YouTube channel. Today, the two guests that we invited will discuss their views on how we build narratives of migrations in archaeology, focusing on European late prehistory. I think we couldn't ask for a better way to wrap up this year's series. And I wish to thank you both, Daniela and António, for having accepted this challenge. Let me tell you a little bit about our guests. So Daniela Hofmann has a PhD from Cardiff University, and her dispersals in archaeological research also passed by Hamburg University before she migrated to the University of Bergen, where she is currently professor for Stone Age archaeology. Professor Hofmann develops projects on the Neolithization of Norway in the light of recent theoretical writing on migration. Her interests include long-term contacts and mobility in Northwestern Neolithic Europe and the creation of inequality, or not, using monumental architecture in later Neolithic of Southern Germany. And right after Daniela's presentation, we will listen to António Valera. Dr. Valera has a PhD from the Universities of Lisbon and Porto. As head of the research unit of Vera Archeologia, António has dedicated the last 20 years addressing the phenomena of ditched enclosures in the context of the trajectory of social complexity between the Neolithic and the Bronze Age. Currently, he leads a highly collaborative project on the role of aggregation centers in the social interactions of late prehistory, providing a first insight on the mobility associated to the monumental ditched enclosure of Perdigões in southern Portugal. For me, this is all very exciting, as I grew up as a kid passionate about the discoveries of archaeology very close to Zambojal. It's this impressive chalcolithic wall enclosure. And I wondered why and for who and by whom these gigantic walls and towers were built 5,000 years ago. While today, I realized that there is still so much to understand about that pan-European phenomenon that coincides with major populational movements, that we start to have some new tools to document and new data to discuss. But let's hear to Daniela's presentation first and António's right after. One last thing, this is a dialogue with everyone in the audience too. So I invite anyone who has a comment or a question to write it in the chat directly to everyone at any moment, even during the presentations. This way we make sure that every insight comes to the table. I will be keeping an eye on it and make sure that those points are addressed in the Q&A session, and invite you to make your own question or comment yourself if you wish to, in which case you can also use the raise hand function. Now, I invite you all to relax, listening to these enjoyable talks, including our two guests, and I'll be with you again in a bit for the discussion.
Well, hello. I hope the recording is working. Thank you very much for having invited me for today's Portugal Archaeological Dialogues. I'm very excited to be here. I'll try and share my screen now and hope that this is working for you. And I hope I'll be on time. So today we're going to talk about archaeological migration narratives and how they have pictured migrations and dispersals. And my case study will cover Central Europe, and I hope, oh no, it's not moving. There we go. And I hope you all have a sort of vague idea of what happens in Central Europe. But basically, we had all been working ever since the advent of post-processualism on this idea that migration narratives were either not relevant if you came from a British tradition, or if you came from a continental European tradition. Migration narratives were still kind of there in the background, but the process of migration was not really, in any sense, conceptualized in detail. However, in the last 20 years or so, migration narratives have really started to come back with a vengeance. And there's been a lot of aDNA research. I'm just showing you a very early example here from mitochondrial DNA. And you see there are big changes that were identified even then. This is from 2013, of different kinds of haplogroups that were suddenly becoming dominant and others that were almost disappearing, etc., etc. And the question became, how could we explain this? Archaeologists often felt kind of steamrolled by these narratives. There was so much to keep up with, and still is a lot to keep up with. It was so difficult to sort of find your feet with all this barrage of data coming in. But in a sense, it's kind of our fault because we had developed so few satisfactory narratives for migration, so few models that we could sort of meet the genetic data with. So today I'm going to contrast two situations in Neolithic Central Europe and just see how the advent of aDNA data worked for both of them, and maybe then to think about how we can build better narratives for both of these. The problem really is that because we hadn't developed from the humanities side, we hadn't developed a set of good, strong models that could be tested that actually maybe talked about different ways in which migration could pan out. The narratives that we were being confronted with were very much stereotypical. And of course, the problem also was that for many archaeologists, these narratives came through the sort of popular scientific press and were then also seemingly unfiltered, being taken over in political discourse. Migration has always been bad. Conservative and right-wing politicians had explicitly made use of archaeology in their campaigns. So you see Nigel Farage there, of course, against modern migration, but then other British politicians like David Rees-Mogg would explicitly use archaeology to argue that migration is not a good thing. And so this in a sense caused a lot of backlash from an archaeological point of view. But really, we couldn't really complain all that much because the narratives in archaeology and archaeogenetics were equally stereotypical, and they are related to each other. The archaeogenetical narratives are basically the ones that we know from culture history and that we declared that they were not really working anymore, but we hadn't put anything good in their place. And so the background idea in our heads is that migration always means large numbers of people. It means tribes, it means, big tracks of wagons with children, women, and all sorts of things, protected by a male warrior horde, very much modeled on the early medieval folk migrations that sort of shaped Central and Northern Europe. Okay, and we love these arrows on maps that suggest that there's one specific origin for these tribes and one specific destination, that they move because there is some kind of pressure. It's not a normal thing. Every normal person surely would sit at home if they could. I'm sure your modern academic careers have led you not at all out of your house. And in the process of migration, identity would remain unchanged. These migrants, they would take their identity and then they would implant it in the place where they arrive. And all this is based, as we said, on a very restricted range of analogies to do with early medieval migrations, basically, or recent colonial history, the migration of Europeans into the Americas, for example, or Australia, and the catastrophic events that followed. So what we're going to look at today is these two classic narratives of migration in Neolithic archaeology and Central European Neolithic archaeology. We long have worked with this idea of groups, peoples, thinly disguised by archaeological cultures that work as identity groups. So we have the linear band ceramic about 5,500 BC, give or take, in Hungary, and then spreading across large areas of Central Europe and bringing for the first time agriculture, animal husbandry, sedentism, pottery, all that sort of thing. And then we have the corded ware, or sometimes also called battle axe culture, or single grave culture, all these things. That happens at the beginning of the 3rd millennium and brings, in the European languages, a new gender hierarchy and a sort of cult of individualized warfare. And these culture historical narratives, both of them, we had spent sort of a generation trying to critique and trying to get beyond. But then exactly at those 2 points, archaeogenetics showed us that there was in fact a big population turnover. So for the linear band ceramic, which as you can see here, covers this very, very big area of Central Europe eventually. The question is really, there is a very large scale change. There's a fast change whenever these band ceramic material culture turns up. It seems to turn up not bit by bit or drop by drop. It does come in quite suddenly. And so I think LBK archaeologists were in a sense much quicker to re-adopt this migration narrative than many, many others. So we can use this as a case study to say, okay, here perhaps this picture that is given by DNA, that there is a quick population turnover, this actually could work in this case, but it actually thrown up a lot of new questions that we had neglected. So in this case, it's a very creative and dynamic process to engage with the DNA data, because for the first time, we actually asked this question, why actually migrate? There have been a few models around, but they hadn't been widely discussed. It's risky, it's expensive. You need to accumulate a lot of surplus if you're going to migrate for settlement. Okay, you need surplus grain, not just for the journey, but also to keep you fed for the entire first year until your own fields yield something. You need to bring enough seed corn, and similar with the animals, you need a massive surplus herd before you can make 2 viable ones. Okay, and it's actually been proven very difficult to find any push factors of why people were migrating. Overpopulation seems to be something that, if it happens at all, it happens sort of late in the Banneramic sequence. It's not the original motor driving this change. So why is it happening? Could it be prestige migration? Could it be that people are there's a kind of ethic there, that people are trying to migrate out, and this is how you spend your surplus production in the first place, to make these heroic migration narratives. We're going to come back to that in a minute. But what we also see is that mobility is kind of generally pervasive. So if you have a good settlement sequence like you do here in the Merzbach Valley, you can see that in the different phases of the sequence, not all the settlements are constantly occupied. There are processes of contraction into one side, of expansion out into the landscape, and the number of houses attested for each phase actually goes up and down quite a lot if you look at the valley in total. So where are all these people going? Could it be that there is actually quite a lot perhaps of not just of out-migration because it's prestige, but also of out-migration because of social tensions, because of conflicts in smaller regional, not overpopulation at a general level, but tensions about access to land or whatever in smaller regional contexts. And these are also questions that we hadn't really, the relationship of households to each other is not something that we had really discussed in fantastic detail for the Banneramic. So we could work with 2 different sorts of models, for example, rather than a massive folk migration because people have to. We could think it could be prestige migration, like, for example, the settlement of remote Oceania in the sort of more historical periods, where there was the setting off, when younger sons couldn't inherit, they would set off on these heroic voyages of exploration and eventually colonize places quite far away, like New Zealand or Hawaii or Easter Island or something. And there's myth making about this, and there's a lot of knowledge about seafaring and all this that had to be acquired, that became a source of prestige in its own right, and so on. And this was mostly driven by charismatic individuals that could convince others to follow them on these journeys and establish new settlements far away, and therefore a new hierarchy of first arrivals. Or it could be more something like you find in the southwestern United States, the so-called Pueblo serial migrators. Okay, so these are people that live in, quite substantial villages, but these villages, even though they look kind of static and like monumental, their social composition changes all the time, because there are a lot of groups at the household level that perhaps they're not happy with the position, or they're being invited by other relatives elsewhere, and they're constantly budding off for various reasons and joining new communities. And there's elaborate processes of, integration, ritual integration, and all this sort of thing that is going on. So the question is, at what scale do we have migrating groups? Are they at the scale of the settlement? Are they actually composites of several different settlements, like in the Western Pacific, where it's just all the disgruntled individuals of an island make off? Is it more the household grouping? And we can start to, by just asking these questions, we can start to sort of break down this black box of migration and to think where it actually happens and what its social purpose is. Is it to alleviate tension and discontent? Is it status behavior, and so on? We can also start to ask what happened to the Mesolithic people who were around. Like many archaeogenetic narratives show us that, initially there is very little admixture, but in a few centuries afterwards, we get what is called a resurgence of the Mesolithic genes. So where are they coming from? Are they hiding all this time? Are they forming like a home diaspora? And it turns out, certainly for the band ceramic, that we're getting more and more indications that, you know, Mesolithic and Neolithic sites are found in very different landscape zones. And so it is possible that people living a hunting and gathering lifestyle could have survived alongside farmers for some time, but it's something that needs to be investigated. Some sites like Bokel-Fenn in the Rhineland, they're turning up dates that fall far into the linear band ceramic, but in fact, the way of life is distinctly Mesolithic, the lithics, the animal bone, all this kind of stuff. We're turning up pottery that doesn't look like band ceramic pottery, is very differently made, maybe forager inspired. But we need now a very big dating program to see how long this parallel survival actually can even go on, especially since LBK people are moving into the uplands as well at some point. And this is also something that has come to light in recent years, and kind of while we were trying to find different ways of explaining migration, we also find that there's a lot more mobility in the system to begin with that we were unaware of. People are using the uplands. We can see this in isotypes. So for example, at the site of Herxheim, which of course is a bit unusual, it's a ritual site, but we see that a lot of people were routinely using the lower mountain ranges or grew up in the lower mountain ranges away from the fertile lush soils that we thought were the center of band ceramic life. We see where sinkholes have been investigated, for example, in Franconia. We see grazing indicators in the upland from the early Neolithic onwards. So people are using the landscape in ways that we had not imagined until about 10 years ago. And we can, of course, also broach the question of, you know, at what point do ethnic groups appear? We've been used to think in terms of territories and in terms of people not getting on. We've been looking at mass graves and so on and thinking, oh, this is the normal way of band ceramic existence. But it turns out that this actually takes a very long time to come about, and that it happens not because people are genetically different from each other, but quite the opposite. These are all people who are very similar from their sort of genetic ancestry, but they're starting to think of the territory differently in the last 100 years or so of this culture, and they're starting to mark their difference in very much more clear ways. So this is also a social process that we now can look at as something that isn't there from the start, but that needs to develop and that needs specific circumstances to develop. So all exciting new questions in the end. So I would say that for the early Neolithic, for the linear band ceramic, ancient DNA has been a really big chance for us to ask entirely new questions. We totally undervalue how migration is a dynamic that is active in all societies to a greater or lesser extent. And this has kept us from asking how it can function as a social practice. You know, who is doing it? Is it different gendered groups? Is it different social status groups? Has it got to do with anything we could call ethnic identity? How could we identify that? Well, very, very thorny subject. And how does this relate genetic patterns and social identity? You know, not just at maybe the massive group level, but also now increasingly we're moving into studies that are considering gender, kinship, family structures, all these things. In contrast, for the coded worm migration, the concurrence between archaeology and genetics has been far less marked. We have narratives of horse raiders coming in, spreading the plague, you know, getting like all the previous populations are sort of brushed away, and we have violence, horse riding, warrior, patriarchy, nuclear family, Indo-European milk drinking, introduced all at one point as part of a Neolithic apocalypse of some kind. But does this actually fit the evidence? Like, do we really see this horizon of a unified culture that's being spread across Europe at this time? Martin Voorholt, who's mapped this, and many others have argued that this is in fact not the case. So if you look at the standard things that we are being told the coded word brings to Central Europe, so one is a new burial ritual that is very strict. But actually, if you look at it in detail, you see that the orientation and the position and in how far they are gendered is very, very different from one region to the other. You see that the kinds of pottery that ends up in graves is far from uniform. And in fact, there is a lot of regional difference in almost all aspects of life, including in how far this new way of existence is actually even taken up. So along the Baltic, for example, we see that there isn't any really big shift in the economy. Fishing and hunting and so on remain very much important. In Eastern Denmark, there is a hybrid situation where at least 3 different cultural groupings seem to be represented in the artifact repertoire. And we see this kind of mushing together into something that is, you know, a much more complicated thing than the imposition of a new package. Similarly, in the Netherlands, we can observe this mainly in the pottery, where local pottery traditions exist alongside the new ones, and there is technological transfer between the two. And certainly in central Switzerland, nothing seems to change at all. The way of life continues as it did before in these lake villages. The only thing that changes very, very quickly is in fact the pottery. So whatever that meant for these societies. In addition, we've been told that these Cordate invaders, they are Yamnaya people from the steppes. But actually, Cordate culture burials differ substantially from Yamnaya ones. Yamnaya ones are generally unfurnished, and they very, very rarely have pottery and practically no battle axes. And what we can see instead is a process that happens in Eastern Europe, for example, in Bulgaria and parts of Hungary, beginning some centuries before the Cordate migration is meant to happen, and where we see a slow coming together of this, the Yamnaya burial rite and local burial rites that did have artifact inventories similar to, Cordate. And there's a slow process of blending. Okay, the Elke Kaiser and others are starting to reveal. So very, very interesting things that show that this is not a package that is storming out of the steppes. It's being developed regionally in different ways. The genetic narratives are catching up with this. So Papac et al. Or Wang et al. Are showing that there is not just the two big waves, but that there is actually a lot of genetic change happening at different points in prehistory. They still have arrows on maps, which is a little bit like, but at least these arrows are now coming from lots of different directions. And some of them seem to coincide better with archaeological culture groups, and some of them less well with archaeological culture groups. But they are showing processes of mixture, resurgences of this kind of DNA, of that kind of DNA. So even from a genetic point of view, we are getting a lot more complexity. We're getting to see that different Cordate groups may have followed different routes into Europe, that there may have been different ways of interacting with local populations, and that even the genetic situation on the steppe will need a lot more work, that we might not just be seeing one wave of migrants from one end of Europe to the other, but that there may have been a two-way exchange, perhaps a three-way exchange, also including the Northern Caucasus and so on. So there is a lot more complexity there that we should be exploring. But also a lot of the changes that we are associating with the Cordate culture may in fact have been there a long time before. I'm very briefly going to introduce you to a site that we are currently studying in a project by the Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft, the site of Riedling in Bavaria, because here we found evidence for the pre-Cordate horizon. Just something called the Kam culture, which is just a few centuries before the Cordate is supposed to arrive. And it has been very badly studied. This is a problem across much of Central Europe, is that we don't understand the pre-Cordate horizon. And so the difference, it seems very, very stark. But actually, we already see much of what we are thinking is typical for the Cordate here. We see that domestic architecture has almost completely disappeared. We just have scatters of pit huts. Okay, so the enclosures are an earlier phase. The ones that are called Erdwerk here, these enclosures, they're early. And then in this later part of the Neolithic, we just have a scattering of pit huts, which may be, unfortunately, the radiocarbon dates hit a plateau here. So it's very hard to guess, to understand the longevity of the settlement. It could be one very short phase, it could be several phases of occupation, but it's a very, very loose scatter that is not really, telling us a big sedentary village existed here. But people are having connections in multiple directions. If you look at pottery material, we see actually an opening up to a wider world. It's a small regional group in Bavaria, but they're importing pottery, or we thought they were importing pottery. These cups with wavy rims that are coming from what is now Central Eastern Germany. These cups with the sort of half moon shaped handles that are coming from across the Bavarian and Bohemian forests, from what is now the Czech Republic. And these sorts of strange shapes, the cups with the really narrow handles, these sort of amphora type vessels that seem to be coming from the Carpathian Basin. But then when we did chemical analysis of this pottery, it turned out that all of it was locally made at Riedling. So what we have here probably is a network of a lot of personal mobility, where either people are coming from far away and producing pottery like at home, or where people are traveling routinely quite long distances and picking up all sorts of different shapes and technologies and ideas. In either way, it seems to be a very, very mobile place. And we also see this, a big change in the economy at this point in time. So in earlier parts of the Neolithic, about say 4000 BC in what's called the Münchshofen culture, we see that people are consuming a lot of meat in their pots. And suddenly when we hit the pre-Cordate horizon, the Kam culture, we see a definite shift towards a milking based economy. There is a lot of milk. and there is hardly any pig anymore, or no pig represented in the lipids, and very, very little pig in the animal bone assemblage. So this could also already be an indication, or we need a lot more data, that this idea of a step-based herding economy with new ways of exploiting animals was actually there quite a long time before. And similarly, we have indications that there may be innovation in the burial rite. So we have very few human bones from the Kam culture, basically none. Okay, but the earliest call-it-ware burials that appear in Bavaria are a little bit atypical. They don't look like the one single person buried with a beaker and a battle axe under a mound. There are multiple burials, or they have atypical lithics, you know, that are part of a transitional or too early flint industry. And these have all just been called, oh, they're a bit weird, and the radiocarbon dates don't seem to work. They come out too early. But I'm wondering whether this is part of sort of establishing a kind of new connection with these faraway places that is bringing new ideas, and then, in a sense, opening up the routes also later for new genetic signatures to spread. So what we should go back to, rather than putting one arrow on a map, is something more like this. This is Elisabeth Ruttkai's map from 1987. And you see lots of migrations, potential zones of influence, people migrating or ideas migrating, or we're not sure. And there's question marks everywhere. And this is much closer, even now, 40 years later, to what it is that we know about how the call-it-ware spreads. So in this case, we can say what happened in the call-it-ware. Well, the genetics, this idea of mass migration, and the archaeology don't really match here at all. We have a substantial influx of new haplotypes, but the timing over which this took place remains substantially unclear. It could be centuries, or it could be very fast. There is no clear horizon of violence. The battle axes, it's unclear if even they were battle axes. Use were traces in Holland seem to suggest that they were more used for preparing fields, perhaps. There is adaptation and there's blending with local traditions that is taking place long before the call-it-ware arrives. And there seems to be likely more than one episode of movement. So no big folk migration on wagon tracks, but more than one direction. This is really more an extension of, you know, a substantial amount of mobility that existed throughout the Neolithic already. So how can we then write better narratives? I think our first task is to broaden our range of historical and ethnographic parallels quite specifically. You know, whether we do this in a statistical way or whether we do this to a more impressionistic way, but we need to think about different ways. For us, still, migration is the atypical thing that needs to be explained, but I think we need to move away from that. Migration and mobility is there in all societies, and we need to understand more the different ways in which it can manifest itself. So it's a social process that works at many different scales, and we have a lot of theoretical and methodological work to do to learn how to grasp this, okay, beyond our sedentary bias. This also means being open about what we know and what we don't know. And I think here archaeologists are a lot better at this than archaeogeneticists. It's very hard to know when they reach a conclusion how much of this is based on the stark aDNA fact and how much of this is an educated guess. But for this to become clearer for everybody, we need to continue to build trust and a shared discussion basis. It's much better now than it was 10 years ago. It's taken a long time, but we need to pursue this also with, you know, younger people who are coming up and doing their PhDs now. And more than anything, I think we need to think very hard about the structural factors. These, you know, bang press releases, the finance models for archaeogenetics labs are the one that rely on a lot of public impact, that rely on having short headlines in Nature or Science, rather than being able to deal with the complexity of the evidence. I think this is our biggest problem, in fact. So before we end, I'd just like to thank all my colleagues here at the Oslo Center for Advanced Studies who are helping us. So, you know, we have a project here, we're helping each other think about migration differently, led by Martin Fuhrholt and me. So here are some of them. I'd like to thank all the people involved in the analysis of Riedling, our enclosure. And I'd like to thank you all for listening. And I hope I haven't overrun too much. Thank you.
Oh, hello, everybody. I'd like to start to thank to ICArEHB and to Carlos for inviting me for these dialogues, and of course to Daniela to participate in this debate. And this, because this is supposed to be a dialogue, my presentation will try to look into the things that Daniela presented, but from a Western perspective, and focused more in Iberia and Portugal, South Iberia. So let me just share my presentation. Okay, I think this is okay now. So I will start by addressing two things that Daniela focused in the end of her presentation. One of which is that mobility and migrations and interaction is always present in society. In fact, societies are based on relations. That's what makes them society. So connectivity, interaction, mobility is always present. There is nothing new about addressing them. What is different is the weight, the importance that in each time and each in which theoretical frame we concede to that specific variable. The second aspect that I would like to mention is that, of course, this issue, migration, is a very political impact, and to understand the ways we deal with it and we dealt with it in the past, it is important to contextualize. And Iberia, namely Portugal, have recent history that are slightly different from the rest of Western Europe, and that might have something to say to understand how we deal with this problem. I put here this picture of the Portuguese Revolution of '74. It marks the period where this earlier impact of diffusionism and in the explanation of social change was very common in historical culturalist approaches, and was also very associated with this ideology of imperialism and colonialism that characterized Iberia and Portugal before these political changes. And of course, after that, there was a complete shift in the theoretical paradigms and functionalistic approaches, and mainly and especially historical materialism had great development, and everything that was related to diffusionism as a sort of explanation was expelled from research and from the narratives that were now focused in the internal dynamics and indigenous process to explain the social change in history, and of course also in archaeology, and also in the periods that were focused by Daniela, I mean the process of neolithization, and later on in the third millennium, the changes that we can see occurring in those communities, prehistoric communities. So I'm not going to develop much about that first period of change. I mean, the Neolithic. It's obvious that something must have come from abroad, because animals and plants that didn't exist here came. But the point is that after this period, and when you focus in the indigenous processes, you start to see a fight between those that were advocating a more quick and mainly based in process of colonies that were established by this leapfrog rapid colonization that established incomes in the territory and then spread the integration of the Mesolithic communities. And you have this all this tendency to focus more in the social role played by local hunter-gatherers, and how these local communities were involved in the process. So you get more complex models and more complex processes of melodization. In the third millennium would be exactly the same. So we have a first explanation based on diffusionism to explain in the presence of these wall closures, and they were related to merchants that come to colonize first and then to build factories later, to trade metal, and they're responsible for the development of calculating communities. And so you have this reaction that tried to look to the internal processes and dynamics favoring the indigenous dynamics. So you get focus on the development of social inequality and all the processes that were related to it. Of course, there was this idea that there were connections, and the evidence was there, and it was undeniable. And we have these sites that have materials that come from many different sites, including from outside Iberia, and this was integrated in these narratives as mainly as interaction that was used as an indicator to measure social complexity, and that these communities were acquiring these goods for social status and social differentiation. So you get this idea that, of course, there were contexts, there were connectivity, but what was moving were mainly raw materials, objects, ideas, and not that much people. The developments of the archaeometric sciences and the applications of the last 30 years increased this idea of connectivity between Iberia and other regions, namely the continent and mainly the Mediterranean basin. We have this since the transition from the 5th to the 4th millennium, and this Alpine axis and obsidian, not in very much quantities. Obsidian is really rare, but especially in the 3rd millennium, you can see these trade routes growing, and a lot of ivory coming, and other products from Mediterranean, like amber, or from Africa, ostrich eggshell, and from Asia, including Asiatic ivory, with roots that we suppose that were mainly using the North Africa, getting to Iberia in great quantities and expanding to Iberia, namely in this southern half. And of course, these connections with the Mediterranean area started to become very clear, but always presented as a sort of influences and trade that did not implicate many movement of people, certainly not in massive terms. Well, recent DNA is more or less adjusting to this idea, because until at least until the middle 3rd millennium, what we can see, we don't see evidences of a significant genetic influence of these areas in Iberia. But of course, we have also the problem of sampling that we'll talk about later. This idea of movement has been increasing in the last years, and if the indigenism approaches sort of produced an inflation of sedentism and of territoriality and fixation of population to a territory, the last decades have been showing us that these calculated communities in the 3rd millennium were much more mobile than we previously assumed in the context of this internal social dynamics. And several sites, namely the large ditched enclosures, have been producing evidence of a significant mobility, of local mobility, regional mobility, more large-scale mobility, that show us that, in fact, throughout Iberia, during the third millennium, there was a lot of movement and of people, of animals, as opposite were more static images that were integrated in the narratives, especially in the last decades of the last century. Well, even more recent studies that are addressing in different ways the connectivity, as showing us, are now trying to capture that mobility, that regional and local mobility, by trying to establish networks of connectivity and draw routes for those networks. This is an example from the Guadalquivir basin south of Iberia. And the approach to the demographic behavior, in this case using radiocarbon dates, is also showing that that social trajectory, yes, mainly was characterized by instability, by very fluctuations in the demographic and numbers in different regions and with different behaviors from diverse regions in Iberia, although we can also see some moments where there are some sort of events that are recognizable in several of these Iberian regions, like this decrease of population in the transition between the fourth and the beginning of third millennium BC. We can see that in different areas, but not in all, as we can see in the southeast. Well, this is picturing a scenario of fluctuation, mobility, instability that characterized Iberia, and that would be the scenario for the so-called arriving of migrations that have been deduced from DNA data in the late third millennium transition from to the second millennium. This instability is not just confirmed or been detected in the demographic behavior. It is also being detected in other approaches like the social network analysis, in this case an example from the eastern side of Iberia, where we can see moments of decreasing of the connectivity that are coincident with the decreasing of population in that same region and in other regions like the southwest, where we can see that in the beginning of the third millennium, there is a decrease of the networks of connectivity and the decrease of population. This is the number of sites, dated sites, and again in the middle of the third millennium, a decrease we can see here and here again. So we have different proxies that are showing that there is a fluctuance in the in the social trajectory of the third millennium in Iberia, and that is not a stable one, and that is not equal for all the territory of Iberia. So when we get to the late third millennium, and we have this information provided by the studies of DNA that say that we have a significant turnover of the genetic patterns in Iberia, and especially in males, you have this continental ancestry that might be responsible for the changes that we can see in the area. We have to cross this information with the other information we have. And what we see, for instance, is that the decay, the demographic decay in the Southwest is prior to this supposed period of invasion or mass migration from continental origin, and it's also previous to the 4.2 event. So the two main explanations that have been researched for explaining the changes in the late third millennium are not very convincing, because we start to see the changes occurring before. So they are not the trigger. They probably could be accelerators of change, but definitely they are not the trigger. We can see the same, especially we could see that this is a significant difference of the demographic behavior from the eastern side of the peninsula to the western side. If you look at this period, the end of the third millennium, the north of Iberia, which has a more or less stable, with some fluctuations, but mainly stable behavior of demography, you have this major breakdown by these two last centuries of the third millennium. And you also have this before, this really large breakdown in the Southwest. But when you look to the graphics that represent the eastern part of Iberia, what you see is that either you get some sort of stability in this period, or you get a continuous growing. The history of Iberia it's not homogeneous in this period. And if migrations implicate significant and important demographic contribution, they are not doing so in all peninsula. Inclusive, there are some people that have provided an hypothesis that this grew of population in this period, the eastern side, was not due, was a result of migrations, but internal migrations in Iberia from the western side to the eastern side. This is just an hypothesis. It has no empirical basis, no data proves this idea. It's just an idea. But what we really can see is that we have a mosaic of behaviors that must be explained, and that so far the genetic data cannot explain. And here you can see also, I can see through the distribution of sites precisely these differences between the Southwest and the Southeast. Both areas were very dynamic areas during the Chalcolithic. You have these large ditched enclosures, you have this investments in monumentality, you have this iconography that expresses an ideology that was spread and shared all over this area. You have these two regions integrated in large-scale interaction networks, and everything of this falls by the end of the third millennium, but with completely two different come-outs in these two regions. In fact, what we get in the eastern side is Elarga culture, with lots of investment in fortifications and monumentality, with evidences of significant social hierarchy, with specific burial traditions. And what we get in the southeast is a completely different scenario, with all the monumentality disappearing. What we get is open sites with pits, nothing more than that. and you get a tradition of burial that also presents a change from collective burials to more individual burials, using pits and hypogea or using cysts, but almost never mixing the negative structures and the cysts. Only one side, to my knowledge, in one side you have hypogea and one cyst, so they are occupying the same territory, but they are not mixing, showing that you have a much more complex situation occurring, and you have this completely two different outcomes of the so-called crisis of the third millennium. In one side, in the western side, southwest, you have a sort of collapse, and it's difficult to characterize what comes next, because it's very hard to find in the archaeological record, except for the graves. So you have these open sites with just bits, and in the other side you have a completely different outcome with a much more complex situation, lots of monumentality, fortifications, large investments in weaponry, and etc. So this plurality of situations advises not to get into simple explanations, and this idea gains more strength when we look at more recent genetic work that is not focused in general trends, because the study of all actually what we wanted to address was to try to understand the present genetic pool of populations. And of course, he has a very long period of analysis with small samples of period and very apart in the territory. So this creates a problem in terms of sampling. Now you have studies that are focused more in more specific areas and with more samples for sites. For instance, you have this ICArEHB study, and one site was analyzed with 67 individuals. Well, this is of course coming down scale, and this allows the detection of things, of subtleties that cannot be detected when you're in the higher scale, with working with more scattered sites and with less samples per site. And this study detected that there are influences, genetic influences from the Iran area, that might come from the Mediterranean area. So we just not have this major influence from continental Europe with this step ancestor C, but you also have influence, genetic influence in this population from Malaga, from the Mediterranean. So this introduces starting to introduce more complex scenario, and parts that we are in fact at the door of this problem. And another interesting thing that we can see from these images is that when we analyze and talk about Bronze Age turnover, these populations tend to might want to relate it to a sort of massive sudden migration. Look at this. The samples are from 2100 to 1500. So we're talking about 6 centuries, 600 years. So these results are from a large period of time. They are not related to a specific moment in history that we can say, talking about an event, massive migration. Now, what we are here dealing with is a period of 600 years. So this introduces sort of come down with the conclusions that we are taking on. And if you relate this, for instance, to this situation, this is the results of the study of Ana Jimenez over the some funerary places in Arga area, and what he discovered by radiocarbon dating programs is that Chalcolithic toy monuments that were built in the beginning of the third millennium and used during the third millennium are still being used for funerary depositions during the Bronze Age in the Ellergard culture. So Ellergard doesn't have just that funerary practices inside settlements that was characterized in early times. It has other practices that are using traditional funerary monuments, and these individuals are not included in the studies of genetics. So it would be very interesting to know what are those genetics that we can get from these individuals, because so far you have here clearly a situation of continuity of relation to the ancestors, relations of to what was happening before that was not integrated in the studies of genetics. So this problem of sampling is not just sampling a house. You have to know what you are sampling. You have to be very critique about sampling to address this kind of approaches. And other elements that we must to which we must confront the genetic data, for instance, this idea of a violent substitution. It doesn't match with the evidence that we have even for Ellergard, which is an archaeological culture. I don't know much the term, but of course you have evidence of violence, you have fortifications, you have a very large amount of you have weaponry, but in fact you don't have that much weapons in terms of quantity, and especially you don't have in the skeletons, you don't have a trauma related to this kind of weaponry. So this idea of violence, that in a way there are some elements of the archaeological record that suggest that violence, then on the other side those same elements are not matching with other elements. So the idea that we have the situation is much more complex. There's a lot going on. Certainly there are people coming into Iberia. Apparently the first signs of this genetic influence from steppe ancestry starting to appear in the second half of the third millennium and the third quarter in some individuals. But the so-called turnover happened during the second half of the third millennium, and they are detected in individuals that cover all that period, not such a narrow period. It's almost, it's in fact the first half of the second millennium. And we see that changes in many other variables of the social system were happening before. So the process is much more complex. DNA is one variable to take into account. It will help us explain, but it doesn't explain. And so I would like to conclude with some remarks that go along with what Daniela said. This calls for much more effective collaboration. We can see that collaboration is starting to develop. Geneticists and archaeologists speak different languages, so we have to try to understand each other. And the first step for that is to understand that genetics it's a tool that allows us to identify and map trajectories and interactions, but it doesn't explain and interpret them. I mean, these are social processes, they are not biological processes. Of course, there are some biology in it too, but the results in the biology are framed and conditioned by the social process. It is the social process that led people from going from one place to another place. It is the social process that conformed that connection between the newcomers and people that are already there. So you have the local trajectories, the local developments. Now it's another variable that interacts there. So all of this is a very complex social process, and it's not explained by biology, not by genetics. And genetics is very helpful to identify moments of change, but to identify trajectories and connections. Again, it doesn't explain them or interpret them. Then, but because it's helpful, it's something that we must, in fact, accept as archaeologists and try to dialogue with. But for that, it's also important that geneticists understand that they have to work at different scales of analysis. As this study that I just mentioned showed that if you go to smaller scales, if you go to look at the more specifically to one site or two sites with more samples from site, you can start to get nuances. You can start to see that things are more complex. You can see influences from different areas, and you can get that because you are working with a smaller net, and you can get things that you won't be able to see if you are just in the larger scale. And it's also easier for communicate, dialogue, and cross information with the archaeologists, because archaeologists mainly work at those small scales and local, regional scales. So it will be easier, the dialogue between us. And geneticists must, in this context of smaller scales, they must start to not just talk about or be interested in large mobility and diffusion, but also in other aspects where they can be very useful, namely the socio-economic process, kinship, matrimonial rules, dietary patterns, technological transfer, and much more. So there's a lot of ground we can cover here, and of course we need this adequate articulation between the geneticists with the archaeological data and theory. And here I would like to finish. I would like to address an issue that Daniela also mentioned in a subtle way when she talked about this strategies for getting resources and for publication and how to deal with the media and so on. That you can see that this genetic work has been developing. I would go a little bit further, and I would say this is more structural than that. I think at least what now I'm focusing in Portugal, in a way in Iberia, especially in Portugal. This idea that there is a tendency that is worrying of decreasing of the importance of social science in archaeology, and an inflation of the lab, an inflation of science research. Science is providing very astonishing results, again, identifying things, but explain them, interpret them. Well, I would say the tools are in social science. And so I think this has an impact in the outcome of the research we are doing and in the narratives that we are constructing for this periods. And that is something that we also have to acknowledge and address in the future, on this relationship between a discipline like archaeology, that I think is still a social science, with historical science, historical social science, with other scientific areas that can be exceptionally useful to our goal, our common goal. So I hope this will help to stimulate some discussion after these two videos. So thank you very much for attending.
Okay. Hello again, everyone. So I think both Daniela and Antonio gave us lots of topics for discussion, several dimensions of research in archaeological migration and the way we build these narratives. We can talk about the scales, both in terms of groups of number of people and geographical scales. We can talk about also other more structural things, and what do we see in the archaeological record. We've seen material culture, we've seen burials, DNA, and I think there are also other maybe other methodologies that can be used. There's isotopes, there's biomarkers. So I would maybe ask to the audience if they have some questions. I am already seeing two. But maybe since it was the first, I would probably ask to Joana Valdez. She put a question. Do you want to make the question yourself? You're free to connect your camera and comment if you want.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Hello. Yes, we can hear you.
Right, so thanks very much, Antonio and Daniela, for the talks. They were really interesting, and migration is a topic that I'm very much interested in as well. I was just well, my question, I'm just going to read what I put on the chat. I'm just saying that so I very much appreciate the value of migration models for social explanation and cultural transformation as well, which I also use in my own research. But I agree that there should not be an over-reliance on archaeogenetics for all the reasons that well, Daniela and Antonio mentioned today. But I was wondering if we're not risking overlooking the possibility of indigenous innovation as well, and if there should not be a dialogue between the two models rather than just relying on one of the, or rather if we should not be kind of thinking about both of them in parallel, so that we don't kind of tend to fall onto one or the other. I don't know. It's not a specific question to either of the speakers, but whoever wants to take it. Thank you.
Thank you. Should I start and waffle, or do you want to start, Antonio? I'll just start and waffle. Thanks for the question. I think, yeah, that's obviously a very, very good point, that we shouldn't think in either or models, and that I think goes for most things in archaeology. I think that the problem there is that we should also not see, like, innovation is never like a process of a single individual sitting in a house thinking up a new thing. It's always a relational process. So the question is, how far out do these relations go? And then also things like mobility and migration. It's not just a one-off thing of a lot of people having to move in, but it's also about a person's, individual mobility in a region where they meet others, where they interact with others, or smaller numbers of people moving in and out. So in a sense, we already have these mixed models all the time, and innovation emerges as a dialogue of all these different people coming into contact. Now, how big the region is that is being brought into contact, that maybe differs. And you might have some of these watershed moments where there is a lot more, let's say, long distance mobility, where there is a lot of novelties introduced. That doesn't mean that people on the ground will be responding to that, but also all the way before then, there is an indigenous social trajectory. Right? It's always fuzzy on the edges. So I definitely think there is no two separate models. There's always a mixture of the two that will sort of differ over time, as a very diplomatic non-answer to your question.
Thanks, Daniela.
Do you want to add, Antonio? Yeah.
No, Daniela said it all. The main word is relation. You never, of course, when you have people traveling, migrations or not migrations, whatever, you have a contact, a relationship. So my point of view, what you have to try to understand is the weight of each one, the weight of the local and the weight of the newcomers in the process of change, so that you can give a more preeminent role to the local people, or a more preeminent role to the newcomers in the process of change. But it will always be a relation. So both models must be related. It's one explanation as opposite to the other explanation. It's not an explanation at all. It just leaves a lot of things outside. So relation, it's the main word. When you're talking about the society, talking about it's all about relations. So a massive migration is just a kind of relation that is going to be established, and of course, independently of are moving, the local ones that are receiving those people, they, in a way or another, will influence the outcome. A war is a relation, so independent of the forces, the losers will always influence the result, the outcome. So it's all about relations. So you can, that's why I don't think models of massive migration as a simple explanation can be accepted nowadays. I mean, of course, they might provoke structural changes, but the result of the structural changes results from the connection, from the relation of what is already there and what is coming. But if you have different things, what comes, if you go, for instance, you have a migration to a region which has a certain structure, social structure, and you have the same migration for another region that you have another social structure, the outcomes will be different because the relations will be different.
Sure, I guess just that I think that the risk is that then models like this, they're really dominant, and they may then just dominate interpretations. And I guess that the new ones that you were talking about, which may be about indigenous innovation or other variables, maybe get lost in these kind of overarching narratives. I guess that was my point. But thanks both.
And don't forget the political issue that is important in these kind of things, especially today.
Okay, we can keep. I see that there's 2 hands raised. Well, one, Hugo, maybe you can go for it.
I think Emily wanted to go first, but if it's the same, I can continue.
Yeah, there she is. Oh, yeah, you're right. So yeah, Emily, maybe do you want to?
Okay, I can go first, and maybe Hugo will also have something to say about this. So it's also picking up on this theme of genetics, and I really like how Daniela was talking about arrows on maps, and Antonio talked about networks, and it seems like, and in fact, something we've seen throughout the dialogue series is that a problem with migration narratives is the underlying assumption of directionality. And I think Antonio started to unpack this really nicely at the end of his talk, so maybe we could discuss it a bit more, are genetics forcing us into framing population interactions or fluctuations as directional movement rather than networks? Or can genetics help us to kind of bring out an otherwise very hard to identify dimension of the archaeological record? So maybe you could share some thoughts on that, and Ugo might also have something to say.
Is that for me?
Do you want to follow up, Ugo, or?
It's to both of you.
I can follow up. I don't know if Daniela or
Daniela
Antonio
and
have
Antonio,
something
if
to
you go
say.
first.
Sure, but if you want to start, I don't know, we're being too polite.
I don't know. I think I have some thoughts on that. So first disclaimer, I'm actually a geneticist, and I had to go through the epistemological shock, let's call it like that, of doing a master's in archaeology and then a PhD in archaeology. And although I don't work with humans, too contentious, I work with plants. But this issue with migration, so there's a question. First of all, I have three thoughts. The first one is, my impression is that both in the biological sciences and in the social sciences, the word migration is very loosely used. For example, how many people is a migration? Okay, how many people something stops being mobility and starts being a migration? And it can be number of people or proportion of a population, both starting and receiving. So 10% of a population moving somewhere, is it a migration or just a mobility? You know, I think these things are never defined either in natural sciences or in archaeology. So that's part of the problem. And we can use historical analogy. Roman Empire, legionaries, after they retired, they settle in some lands all over the empire. Is that a migration? German troops coming to help the Roman Empire, they're not called a migration, but then suddenly Visigoths is a migration. You know, there's all these loosely used terms, even in the social sciences, that apparently go unquestioned, but when geneticists use migration, you know, it's whole hell breaks loose. It's a bit unfair. This said, I do think that I do have issues with the migration theory, at least for the late Neolithic, Chalcolithic. Another issue is the issue of communication to the media. Now, let me tell you that in the natural sciences, we suffer from that all the time. You know, I discovered that a gene might have some effect on a cancer. The media reports the cure for cancer has been discovered. You know, and this is everyone who works in the natural sciences knows you need to have a lot of careful when you talk to the science. Even scientific outlets like New Scientist or National Geographic, you always need to be a bit careful. I mean, and of course, you know, sometimes the way that we use language can lead to that mistake. I mean, as a biologist, we see alleles or genes in one way and then showing up in another, we call it a migration. It's not right, I must say. I think a lot of caution needs to be taken with this. It's just a matter of language, and this is where the dialogue with archaeology is needed. And regarding what Antonio was saying about funding for you know, a lot of funding being driven to genetics, it's not quite right. 2 weeks ago, I was talking to someone who sits at the ERC panel, not every year, but occasionally. And she was saying that there's a lot of projects, lots of applications to the SH6 study of the human past panel that have been rejected on the sole basis that it was just geneticists and there was no archaeologist or historian in it. They were outright rejected. So there is a deliberate effort that genetics is to be seen as a tool to answer an archaeological question, but it does require, you know, a team of geneticists. And again, this said, there's a lot to correct in terms of geneticists not talking to archaeologists and just deciding that they're instant experts on whatever just because they read Renfrew and Bahn, and suddenly we know everything about archaeology. So you know, there's definitely a lot of dialogue on that front, but you know, it's like saying, oh, there's a lot of money going into radiocarbon dating. Not really. You know, it's archaeogenetics is a tool to answer archaeological questions. And you know, and obviously a dialogue and teamwork is necessary, and there's a lot of work to do on that. On what Emily was saying about arrows, I don't know, I've seen a lot of arrows during my history books and even my archaeology books. There's arrows everywhere. You know, you see the spread of the Neolithic with arrows. You see, I don't know, Hittite, Neo-Assyrian, whatever. There's arrows everywhere. There's the Aztecs moving somewhere, and there's arrows. I very, very rarely see networks in archaeological literature. I'm not even talking about biological sciences. So I think that's actually part of the tradition in which individual archaeologist moves, and the tools that she uses, and the tool and you know, the epistemological framework under which she works. So I don't think that's necessarily. On the other hand, there's a lot of networks in genetics. There's reticulated evolution. There's definitely a lot of tools that use network connections rather than, you know, typical arrows. So, you know, again, there's a lot of dialogue that needs to be going between both fields. But yeah, but the question I have is that if a lot of this discussion is just in definition of the word migration, you know, and how it is so loosely defined. So, thank you.
All right. Thanks
Yeah.
for that. I agree with you to a large extent, but not entirely. So I think it's true that we are perhaps a little bit loose in defining migration as individual scholars, but there has been quite some effort recently to try and come to terms with what it actually means and what needs to be fulfilled to call it a migration. So how many people is one option that you've mentioned, but others have argued that it could be not so much about the number of people, but about the sort of how far outside the usual social context they are taken, so that even a single person can be said to undergo a migration as long as it's kind of far enough out of their comfort zone. And others have argued that it's the duration that you spend in the place that you're going to, so that you should use mobility for things like, say, seasonal movements or planned movements in a kind of, I don't know, nomadic pastoralist sense, where it's a sort of routine thing, but you should use migration if you're then spending a very long time away, years and years and years, right? Undefined duration. So I think really we're never going to get a single definition of migration. You know, and do you focus on the process? Do you focus on the reasons? Do you focus on integration at the other end? I think we need to be more careful in how we define it, you're right. But it's going to always have to be very situationally specific and tailored to your research question of where you're going to draw that line. And similarly with the arrows and maps, of course, I agree we're guilty of those as well, but we've been trying very hard to get away from them. And now they're all coming back, you know, it's like a losing battle. So different ways of mapping would definitely be a good thing. What I was wondering about the networks, and this is a question for the geneticists in the audience, I think there's several hiding down there somewhere, is, you know, the reason it was always such a problem, or that it is such a problem now, is that we have archaeological cultures that move with arrows from one spot to another. And we have these, what geneticists call populations. And we've tried too hard sort of mapping them onto each other, but is it possible to sort of dissolve this assumption that we start with a population that then moves and mixes with another population? Because, you know, also your population is really a historical process, and there is kind of admixture all the time, and there aren't any clear borders to a population genetically defined, I don't think. So is it possible to conceive in statistics and stuff of populations as a much wider network, or do we always have to start with 2 units or 3 units? that start out as different and then merge. This is something that's not clear to me.
No, there are methods. I mean, it's called reticulation networks, and some people favor it, some people don't. But in typical population genetics, you consider a diverse population, and then you see what happened from there, both locally or whatever birds migrating. Or but it's usually assumed, something that gets lost. It's usually assumed that the population, both whatever starting point or end point, it's always diverse, both biologically and, I would add in this case, necessarily culturally diverse. And this is an error I think archaeologists have done in the past as well, which is to consider a culture as a homogeneous entity based on material culture, which of course it's not. There's individuals who will be different or have different material culture or different expressions or etc. And it's the same biologically. So it's just usually in the genetics there is a tendency to use models that simplify things. I mean, this is by no means an exclusive of the biological sciences. I mean, what I think the noise comes from is when geneticists try to interpret these patterns. So say you have radiocarbon dates all over Europe, right? Just radiocarbon dates. In itself, it tells you nothing. You need to interpret it as an archaeologist, right? It's the same thing with genetics. I can tell you distribution of genetic diversity in a map, tells you nothing. You need to interpret it. And I think a lot of this problem is when geneticist looks at it and goes like, oh, all the males were coming, killing everyone and raping all the women, etc. This is where I think it's a problem. If you use reticulation or arrows or whatever, I don't think that's the source of the problem. It's just a simplification or not. Depends on the level you want to go deep. If you want to go very deep, you'll use reticulated networks. If you just want a general view of whatever phenomena, then I mean, there's no problem using arrows, right? I think. But in general, it's just how you interpret the patterns. And that, of course, is a job for the archaeologist. The genetic data tells you nothing about it.
António, do we have anything to add to this definition question, and also maybe not only migration but also network definition of networks are being discussed in the chat?
The problem in archaeology is very difficult to establish the networks. You might have the starting point or an idea of a starting point. You have an idea of the ending point. And then you have problems to defining the process and how things move in space and the process through which they move. You see the same thing, for instance, when you deal with exogenous materials that circulate from for instance, if you have ivory from Indian elephant that at the time of the 3rd millennium lived in Palestine, that the ivory comes from there and you have it in Iberia. You don't know the network. It's impossible to try to at the moment with the data that we have. It's very difficult to reconstruct the networks and all the complexity of the networks, especially because these kind of items, they tend not to circulate alone. They tend to circulate in groups of resources, and those groups they are built in very complex ways. So the shortest, for instance, the shortest way might not be the way that is used, because you are connecting your resource with other resources through other ways. So it's very complex to deal with networks and build the networks. So that's why we tend to put arrows on maps. But but especially at the present, if you read the text that go along with the maps with arrows, we see that the process it's more complex. People are aware that the process is complex. The problem is that for most situations, you don't have data to really build those networks. So you tend to focus on the origin and the endpoint. But of course, I've just show you in my presentation a study of connectivity using network analysis that precisely tries to see how these connections are established, these networks are established, and especially fluctuations in the networks, moments of crisis and moments of recovering of the networks. But it's not easy to really build a network, for instance, for the circulation of some kind of resources, and I imagine for people is the same, or for animals, for instance.
Okay, I was going to ask Joanna if she would add more anything else, since she asked about networks. She already said that perhaps more open source data sets could help. Do you want to elaborate, Joanna?
Well, I was just thinking about the networks because Ugo was talking about it, and I guess that I think that this discussion is being about a lot of very big concepts that have different definitions in the different disciplines. And I think that is, I mean, I don't think that we will ever find one definition that suits everyone. So I think it's a bit what Daniela was saying. You have to adapt it to your own research questions and your things, what you're looking at. How does it serve your purpose, I suppose? And I guess that with networks, it's a bit like that as well. I mean, it can have a lot of definitions. It can have a lot of purposes. It can be represented in several different ways, depending on what you need it for and how you look at it. So I guess that was my point about networks, or at least what I was thinking about when Ugo was talking about that as well. But yes, I mean, in terms of what Antonio was saying, that we don't have enough data. I mean, there's probably a lot of data out there that could be really useful for these sort of studies. It's just that they're not readily available. They're not somewhere where you can go and just download. Sometimes it's really difficult to get access to them. People are often a little bit, not very comfortable in sharing their own data or the raw data sets at least. And I think that when we kind of overcome these issues, I think that a lot more of these sort of studies or relational studies might come through, because it takes a very long time to collect a very good data set to kind of, for instance, develop a network science model that will be detailed enough to actually provide meaningful results. So I guess, when we stop being so attached to our data sets, perhaps that might be a way forward, I guess.
Joanna, if I may add to that, you're absolutely right. But for example, in terms of genetics, to publish it, you need to put it online. It's perfectly shareable. The problem is having the skills to reanalyze it, but that's a different thing. Whereas with archaeology, I think there's also initiatives now, like to make it, if you want to publish, you need to make your data available, at least the measurements you did, or whatever radiocarbon databases.
I think it's encouraged, but it's being encouraged, I think. And there's some journals that actually give you the tools to do that. But I think in some places it's already quite common. But I think people that work with computational archaeology methods tend to kind of do that more. So I'm sure we'll get there.
Yes, it's always about the data that we have, and of course the limitations of the archaeological record that are many things that are being discussed depend on. But there's another question. I think we have time for the point that Roz has raised. About what about failed migrations and the questions of timing? Are migrations a continuous process? I don't know if Roz wants to ask it better or elaborate. Go for it.
No, I probably did a wonderful job, Carlos, in my small notes. It was just because Hugo's been talking and Daniela and Antonio have been talking about how we identify migrations, and I was just sort of wondering, and this has come up in previous dialogues on this migration topic about failed migrations. You know, I suppose in one, when does the gene flow stop, and how do you identify archaeologically, and the time length? I know that Martin Fulholt and Mark Thomas, on the other hand, from a genetics perspective, it's also defined like how long a population may be turned over. I think that's how they use it, the geneticists. And also archaeologically, you know, different, or anthropologically, different types of migration. I was just sort of wondering, how do we, you've probably talked about this and I didn't quite get it, but how do we define this, and where do we move, like, yeah, in terms of creating these narratives? I won't explain that. Okay. But thank you very much.
Do you want to address it do you want to address it to anyone in particular?
No, not really. You're all very good. So let's see.
Any thoughts?
If I may answer, Ross, that's a really interesting question. That would be a whole new project to look at. I would just suggest a good case study would be the Pacific Islands, because I think there were there we can definitely call it a migration because the islands were uninhabited and people were moving there. And I think there's some instances where there might have been 2 waves of migration in particular. I could be wrong. But, you know, to be a good test for that, you know, how do we detect failed migrations? How do we detect stop movements and this type of thing?
Yeah, if I can comment that. By the way, can you hear all the noise behind me? No?
No, we hear you perfectly.
No, excellent. No, we have a daily demonstration because we have the Russian embassy next door. So the Ukrainians turn up every day at 6:30 and they're loud, which is fair enough. As long as you can hear it, that's good. So the Pacific is a very interesting case indeed, but there's a lot of debate there about migrations and the possibility of returning once you are on those isolated islands. And then therefore the question of whether sequences on the very small isolated islands stop because people have in a sense all died because of the ecological catastrophe they caused when they moved there, or whether they have actually moved on or back. So, but that's in a sense a very, very extreme situation in a way. And even there, as dating gets better and the research gets better, it seems that in most cases, at least for several centuries, it was possible to move both ways. And it's a very late development that places like Hawaii, New Zealand and Easter Island became isolated from everyone else. So we should, and genetics probably one day will tell us, but we should think that there would be several waves of in and out, and maybe even from South America eventually, like with the sweet potato. But other than that, I think it would be very hard to identify at what point a migration fails in a more continental European setting. You know, what is it that you want to achieve? Do you want to oust the indigenous population? Then maybe, but this is very hard to show archaeologically what people actually wanted to do. So I think it's a very, very difficult question. Interesting.
I was just thinking of you know, Yoshi and is it Stefan Sproschen? And he was telling me about there was a settlement that sort of goes out from the main group, and I suppose it's on different scales, as you guys have been saying, is like migrations and mobility is on different scales and different numbers of people, as Hugo was saying, like, what is a migration? Is it a whole, you know, everyone and his chicken, not chickens, sorry, everyone and his, you know, sheep, they come over and And I was just, you know, why did they go there for a bit and then come back? And I was going to try and do some isotope data with them, but it was just sort of kind of interesting, as you say, like, why do they come back? They don't die. But then you imagine, like, I suppose Canada's quite an interesting, there was some really interesting ethnographic work done in Canada where there's these houses in the wood where, well, some Indians might have killed them, but also they died of disease. And then they come 50 years later and they find these houses in the woods. And I always sort of imagined this in the LBK situation where these little satellite settlements go out and no one has heard of them, and then they die. So anyway.
This is an even darker reading of the band ceramic than what I'm used to. All these islands of dead people in the wood. No, I know the study you're talking about. You could probably read it as a failed colonization, but then I think, is it failure or is it resilience? You know, because they tend to move back. They're at the very edge of what's possible where they are with the rainfall patterns and the temperature, and they seem to just kind of move away when it's no longer possible. But you know, is it then failure? Is it just they're not that far, they're moving 20 kilometers north again and it's fine? So, you know, they're moving back towards the Danube, towards the main valley, and it's all good. So it's difficult to decide how they would have seen that process, but definitely interesting to think about, I think.
Yes, definitely very interesting points. Maybe perhaps Antonio, I think if you want to comment on some of the last things that were said, and on Ross's comment, do you want to say something?
Well, I would say that it's very difficult to identify that at least in the European archaeological record. Mm-hmm. Especially because how do you identify in archaeological terms? How do you identify migrations? By archaeological materials, mainly, and well, archaeological data. The point is that it has to do with the definition of migration. How long does it have to be called a migration? Because if you have short movements, you probably couldn't detect it in the archaeological record. Or you can have, for instance, you can have connections between different regions that are established regularly during a certain period of time, and you start to see changes in the archaeological record that doesn't necessarily are related to a massive movement of people. So the problem is also, how do we identify in archaeological terms what we define as migrations? Because there are these two problems: the definition of what we call a migration, and how do we recognize it in the archaeological record? Because if you think of migration in terms of process or in terms of time, you can have different answers from the archaeological record. I don't know if I'm making myself clear in this point. So it depends on the two issues, on the definition and how we assume we identify it in the archaeological record. And then we have other situations that has to do, for instance, with the networks and the process, for instance, of resistance. That is something that we didn't talk about here, and that I think it's important. It's for instance, if you you tend to address or assume, interpret some realities as a social resistance when you don't see certain archaeological materials or certain archaeological data in certain regions, and you see it in the surrounding areas. So you tend to interpret that as a resistance to those influences and possibly to migrations. But you are assuming that, again, migrations are homogeneous processes, and they are not. And so even if it's not a massive movement of people, but for a certain period of time you have these interchanges, these connections, and things start to change due to this interaction. The areas where these changes occur, they are not homogeneous. You can see that from, for instance, on the Bell Beakers in Portugal, where you have a completely different situation in the south of Portugal to the rest of the central and northern Portugal and to the rest of Iberia. You have a completely different behavior associated to the Bell Beakers, and that is something that makes this process much more complex and hard to identify and define if you are dealing with a territory that was resisting to some influences or to some migrations or whatever, or if it's just absorbed it in a different way. Again, the question of relations. The relations established in that particular area might develop an outcome that was different in the regions around it, or because it had different timings. So I think basically we are dealing with processes that are extremely complex, and possibly the theory of complex systems could help here to try to understand the differences in the nuances that we can see in different areas. So that's why I think the question of accessing the data is very important. And I feel that, for instance, in Iberia, it's very difficult to access data in order to try to build these networks and the way things are changing, and then evaluate the question, the variable of migration. This from an archaeological point of view alone, not of course genetics. It's another variable that we can add to the problem. But again, for the genetic approach, it's very important that we are really sure of what we are analyzing, because, for instance, for LRGAR, it's very important that people, where the turnover, the supposed turnover, is very strong, you can see that. But again, no individual that was buried in the Toloi, in the 3rd millennium Toloi, in the LRGAR culture, were analyzed. So you have here a part of the population, of LRGAR population, that was being buried in traditional Toloi tombs, together with the Chalcolithic individuals that were already there, and those were not analyzed in the studies of genetics. So we also have to establish very well what are we analyzing, and that is established in archaeological terms.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Antonio. I think that was a very nice conclusion to wrap up this dialogue. I think it's time. There are some more things in the chat. Soline Denise is letting us know about a project in Kiel, working on networks. And yes, and also Francisco Alves Cardoso noticing that indeed there are more policies about open access data, which is important, also in the social sciences. And about the question of Stuart, about earliest Homo sapiens in Europe, migrations, well, it's a different chronological period, but I take the opportunity to remind you that all our previous dialogues, some of them with this chronology, are available to watch on ICArEHB webpage and YouTube. So that being said, I'd like to say thanks to all the participants, and especially to Daniela and António. And before saying goodbye, the production is telling me that we have a message from the director of ICArEHB. So let's hear to Vera Aldeias.
Hi, everyone. Unfortunately, I couldn't be with you today as I'm already in the field doing field work, but I wanted to leave you with a thank you to our participators of today's dialogues, but also from previous sessions. It's been really wonderful to be able to see all the science being done in the field of human evolution. Here at ICArEHB, we are researching this topic too, and we're using a set of interdisciplinary tools to do so. So it's been very wonderful to be able to participate and have you giving some of our sessions in the ICArEHB Dialogues. I also want to leave a special thank you for everyone attending our dialogues. It's been great to see such a global audience. And for that, we really want to thank you all. I also want to thank a special group of people that have been behind the ICArEHB Dialogues. So those are the people that have been preparing and recording and talking with everyone to make this possible. Some of them you've seen them on camera, but there are others in the background. And to all of them, our special thank you. We are already preparing the next season of ICArEHB Dialogues, and it's going to be tremendously exciting. We are looking for different topics and different ways of dialoguing in the topic of human evolution. So I do hope you can join us for next year, ICArEHB Dialogues. To all of you, my thank you, and I wish you well. Bye.
Exactly. Okay. Thank you for your words, Vera. And for everyone else, keep following our media pages and checking ICArEHB Twitter and Facebook, because we will announce the Dialogues 2024 soon. And I can tell you that it's going to be different, and we are looking for dialoguing with you all next year. So bye-bye and obrigado.